The past two videos have been building the foundation for discussing historical materialism. In today's episode of Fundamentals of Marx, we will be covering precisely that. If you haven't watched the video on materialism and the video on dialectics, I strongly encourage you to do so. To provide a concise definition, we can say that historical materialism is the application of materialist dialectics to the study of history. Many of the central aspects of dialectics and materialism, at least as they are understood by Marxists, are more or less unchanged in the historical materialist method. For example, in line with materialist dialectics, historical materialism fundamentally believes that history and the societies we study are in constant motion. They are always changing. This change can sometimes be quantitative, while at other times it becomes qualitative. Qualitative changes are normally found in explosive events, like revolutions or wars. Additionally, the various phenomena in societies are interconnected and cannot be understood in a vacuum. To study and understand one concept, you will inevitably have to understand many more concepts. The main force of motion in history is the material, specifically the material conditions of societies. Whereas idealists believe that history is moved by great people and great ideas, historical materialism suggests that great ideas are born from specific and concrete conditions in history. A historical materialist acknowledges the influence and contribution of individuals and ideas, but places them in a web of political, economic, and social trends occurring in their time. Because history is in constant motion, and because nothing exists in a vacuum, historical materialists reject the notion of eternal principles or phenomena. Proponents of capitalism like to identify capitalist elements in past systems as proof of the natural origins of capitalism. This is unscientific and ahistorical because it pulls certain elements out of their context and forcefully places them in locations where they don't belong. The motivation for this is ideological. Supporters of capitalism want to legitimize the current system by suggesting that the principles and mechanisms it's built on have existed forever and are simply the way things are. If we follow the method of historical materialism, we would quickly see that capitalism is a specific social development in history with a unique economic basis. It cannot be found in the feudal system because the social and political structures of that time developed from a fundamentally different economy. Historical materialism finds that the development of societies is primarily contingent on the forces of production and relations of production. In simpler terms, the way a society looks and functions is determined by how and with what things are produced and the social relations associated with the production process. The feudal era in Europe, for example, relied on serf or peasant labor, which utilized livestock and handheld tools to produce goods. The relations of production were organized around the lord-serf dynamic. The tools of that time were notably more complex than the tools of past eras. To incentivize optimal use of the means of production, feudal lords were better off loosening the grips on their subjects, at least in comparison to slaves and the slave labor that dominated the past. Thus, peasants were no longer considered property like slaves were, and actually had some of their own property which they used to work their lord's land. Capitalism brought with it a new economy. Industrial production meant that individual producers could not keep up with large enterprises. As land and resources began to be bought up by capitalists, social relations changed as well. Now the economy was predominantly determined by the capitalist-worker dynamic. Unlike lords, capitalists offered their social subordinates wages instead of physical security in exchange for labor. The change from serf labor to wage labor meant a necessary shift in political structures and laws. Complex machinery and the use of highly developed equipment meant that the capitalists benefited from, and indeed needed, a more educated and sustainable labor force. Each new social formation with its own distinct economic base was in some way or another more progressive than its predecessor. Serfs had better lives than slaves, and workers have better lives than serfs. This is why many Marxists acknowledge the historically progressive role of capitalism. The next stage, however, is a radical departure from the previous systems. In the past, we saw the preservation of a core dynamic in each system: exploiter versus exploited, dominant versus subordinate, etc. There was always a powerful minority that dominated a disenfranchised and oppressed majority. Socialism, which Marx and others saw as the next stage after capitalism, is at first a reversal of that relationship. The majority becomes dominant. A people's revolution necessarily transitions the power from a minority class of exploiters to a majority class. The objective of the majority class is to erase class boundaries altogether, to erase the age-old exploiter-exploited social structure once and for all. It's important to note that capitalism produces the conditions for socialism. Capitalism created the workplace as we know it, where large numbers of people regularly work in close proximity with each other. Capitalism needed the production process to occur on a large and highly concentrated scale. Having achieved this, capitalism also created the conditions for socialism to take place. Finding themselves in the same spaces, living very similar experiences, the working people are granted both a means and a reason to produce change. As transnational corporations erase borders and erode the nation-state, the possibility of socialist revolution magnifies. Historical materialism is a powerful scientific tool. However, it can be misinterpreted and misused. We should be careful in creating a linear or deterministic vision of history. Some people may be tempted to find a linear pattern of progression set in stone by stages that are supposedly predetermined. Such an interpretation of history is not true to the historical materialist method because it ignores nearly all its fundamental principles. If history is determined to follow a linear and so-called upwards path, then there is no notion of a constant state of change. Change is no longer based on shifting conditions and overlapping causes, but rather on some specific vision that is set in stone. At that point, we are no longer analyzing history scientifically. Instead, we are creating universal and unchangeable characteristics that exist outside of any real observations of the world and are dependent entirely on ideology. Some of the confusion that creates formulaic history can be attributed to Marx himself. His fixation with European history and European modes of production allows some critics to say that Marxism is Eurocentric, that historical materialism describes the European path of development. Of course, it should come as no surprise that Marx was focused on Europe as he lived and worked there his whole life, with no exception. Because Marx applied historical materialism to his study of Europe, much of the analyses he produced were indeed Eurocentric. Did non-European societies experience a different path to the present day? Absolutely. If we use historical materialism to understand the histories of other parts of the world, as Marx did for Europe, we would almost definitely produce a different variant of what Marx found in his studies. Another area of historical materialism that has been distorted is the idea that social and political structures of a given society are determined by the economic base. While it is true that this is a fundamental relationship in historical development, Marx, Engels, and many others who followed them repeatedly reiterated that that relationship is not one-sided. It is just as likely that social and political structures affect the economic base they are connected to, and many times in history we have witnessed precisely this kind of activity. Suggesting otherwise is essentially nothing more than vulgar materialism. It is the equivalent of saying that human thought has no impact on the material reality around it, which neither Marx nor any of the other major scholars had ever advocated. In summary, historical materialism is not a philosophy of history. It is not about grand narratives and a perspective that is set in stone. More accurately, it is a scientific tool that we can use to uncover the nature of different historical events and periods. If there's anything to take away from this video, and the videos on dialectics and materialism, it is that the world around us is incredibly complex. Marxism and the materialist dialectic make this assumption going into any analysis of social, political, or economic phenomena. Mao and Lenin insisted on this same assertion regularly, and the idea of complexity is at its peak in Althusser's concept of overdetermination. This idea goes hand in hand with the observation that everything is in a constant state of change. If we should remember anything about materialist dialectics and historical materialism, it is these two things. That's it for today's video. Please leave your thoughts in the comment section below. A huge thanks to the Patreon supporters who make this project possible. Thank you for watching, and until next time, remember, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it.